Well, agreeableness is something like, in a given negotiation, the sex is in those two traits, especially with neuroticism. Agreeableness, well, agreeableness is something like, in a given negotiation, how much are you arguing for you and how much are you arguing for the other person? And the more agreeable you are, the more you argue for the other person. And that's part of caretaking. Disagreeable people are more competitive. They're harsher. They're blunter. Now, modern personality theorists tend to associate that with psychopathology, and that's a big mistake. It's a big mistake because being disagreeable is not pathological in and of itself, right? There's very many admirable things about being disagreeable. In fact, if you want to hire a manager, the best managerial data show that disagreeable managers do a better job than agreeable managers. Why? Because the agreeable managers get taken advantage of, right? Thing about being agreeable is you think the best of everyone. You don't have much of an imagination for evil. Makes you very cooperative. Makes you easy to be around unless you're resentful. What's the disadvantage? If you're agreeable, a malevolent person will walk all over you. And there are malevolent people. And agreeable people don't like that idea at all, because they like to think the best of everyone. And that's fine when it's true. But it's not fine at all when the person you're dealing with is not your friend, right? And 5% of the population, 3 to 5%, is seriously tilted towards psychopathy. That's 1 in 20, 1 in 30. Imagine the worst kid in your elementary school class, you know, the one who was not so good every year, right? Well, 3% of the population, they can cause an awful lot of trouble. And they're very good at preying on agreeable people. In fact, that's who they seek out. So you got to watch that if you're agreeable. And that's the downside of that cooperative proclivity. You know, you're very good at caring for people, very cooperative, but you're putty in the hands of someone who's truly malevolent. This is being modeled, by the way, by game theorists. So you can set up cooperative games online, let's say, and watch how the community functions if all you have is cooperators. And so you can set up stable games that are composed of nothing but cooperative players. But if you drop one shark into the tank, he takes everything. Right, so that's the downside of agreeableness. So that's offset by disagreeableness, more of a masculine trait. It manifests itself in competitiveness. And women prefer men who are somewhat disagreeable. It's complicated. We already walked through that. That's that Beauty and the Beast conundrum, is that women are more sexually attracted to higher status men who have a certain predatory element, but that are productive and generous. And so what a woman is really looking for is a man who has disagreeable traits, so that's an integrated shadow, you'd say, from the psychoanalytic perspective, but who's also integrated the more feminine element that would be associated with generosity and hospitality and the ability to care for others. Right, so that's agreeableness. Fourth trait, conscientiousness. Industriousness and orderliness. Men and women are about equally conscientious, but women are higher in orderliness and men are higher in industriousness. And so, and the differences aren't huge, but they tilt in that direction, much to the dismay, I think, of the average woman whose threshold for mess in a household is slightly lower than her husband. One of the things that's weird about personality traits is there doesn't have to be much difference between you and your mate to make all the difference in your relationship. So one of the things I noticed, for example, with my kids is my threshold for my child's misbehavior was slightly lower than my wife's. And so that meant I did most of the discipline, not all of it. But I noticed if I just shut up for 10 seconds when my kids were being annoying, then my wife would intervene. It's just that she didn't get annoyed quite as fast as me. But since it's a threshold phenomena, we didn't need much of a difference between our temperaments to make a real difference in outcome. And so, all right, last trait, openness to experience. It subdivides into something like aesthetic appreciation and creativity. That's one, and interest in ideas. Men and women are about the same in openness, but women are higher in aesthetic appreciation and men higher in interest in ideas. And so women like nonfiction and men like fiction. Sorry, women like fiction and men like nonfiction. Quite a reliable gender difference. And it reflects that underlying difference in temperament. And so how does that play itself out in the world? YouTube tends to be a male-dominated social media platform, especially long-form podcasts. They're idea-centered, not aesthetic-centered. So that's one difference. And it's weird because, see, in most enterprises are dominated by people who are particularly high in interest or ability in that domain. And so small differences in the mean can make a big difference in gender representation in any domain. So like men and women overlap to some degree in their interests and in whether or not they're agreeable, but way more men are engineers. It's like 10 to 1. Why? Well, you have to be really interested in things and not very interested at all in people to be an engineer. And almost all the people like that are men, right? Because it's the extremes that are making the difference. It's the same with nursing. Like the Scandinavian countries have been trying to gender balance engineering and nursing for like 30 years. It just goes nowhere. Like they put all this effort and time into it, and for a while there's a few more female engineers, but then when the social manipulation collapses, it goes back to like 10 to 1. Same on the nursing side. And so what seems to happen is when you make a society gender equal, men and women can pick their occupations based on their interest and their temperamental proclivities, and you get quite a lot of gender differentiation. And how that'll play out in the long run, we really don't know. I mean, a lot of weird things are happening in our society at the moment. I mean, it's 2 to 1 women to men in universities. And there's some evidence that the women stop attending at about that ratio. You know, because why do you go to university? Well, to get educated, but partly when you're 18, you go to university to meet a mate, and it's pretty damn slim pickings for the women at the typical university now, because it's 2 women for every man. Man, that's of great advantage to the predatory men, by the way, right? Because what happens to the women, it's so awful because they're hypergamous. Even though you'd think the men who are terribly outnumbered would now have an opportunity on the mating front, what actually happens is the successful men have hyper opportunities. And so they're very likely. So the women are chasing a small pool of successful men at the universities, and the hyper-successful men have a huge choice of women, and so the women don't have an opportunity for stable long-term relationships, and the men get to be trained to be exploitative psychopaths. So that seems like a very bad long-term solution. God only knows what that's going to do on the university side. You know, we really have no idea because it's never happened before, right? But the men are bailing out of higher education in droves. And so, well, we'll see what happens over the next 20 years. No one really knows. Okay, so let's relate the personality traits to what else we learned, and then we'll draw this to a close. You can take extroversion and openness. They make a meta trait, because they're slightly correlated, called plasticity. Highly plastic people, extroverted and open, are very entrepreneurial, and they're also very exploratory. So their basic mode of adaptation in the world is the exploratory mode, right? And the other 3 traits, emotional stability, reverse of neuroticism, okay? So resilience to negative emotion, agreeableness and conscientiousness, they clump. Stability. And so the adaptive advantage to people who are high in stability is they're conscientious, so they work hard. That's a good predictor of success. They're emotionally stable, so they don't suffer much. They're agreeable enough to get well along with others. So they're well integrated into their social communities, and that's sort of their niche, right? The entrepreneurs are pulled out of the plasticity class, and the more conservative managerial and administrative types that keep the show on the road when everything's going well, they're high in plasticity. And you can see that both of those approaches would have their advantage and that they're both desirable. I mean, I don't know if you could probably pick a single personality trait out of the hat that would most make you happy, you'd pick low neuroticism. Because when people say they want to be happy, but when you analyze that, you find out that's not true. What they really mean is they don't want to be miserable. Extroverts are happy. People high in neuroticism are miserable. When people say, I just want to be happy, they mean, I wish I wasn't anxious. I wish I wasn't in pain. I wish I wasn't angry and frustrated and disappointed and grief-stricken. That's really what we want, is cessation of negative emotion, more than thrilled enthusiasm. And so your life is a lot less burdensome if you're low in neuroticism. Now, you might be less sensitive to danger. And, you can see that as a problem. There's something about being on edge. You're going to see danger when it appears. That's kind of the curse that women live with. But it's hard on you existentially. Open people are creative. Extroverts are gregarious. Agreeable people are cooperative. Disagreeable people are competitive. Open people are creative. Those are all niches. There's a place for everyone. One of the ways of thinking about the world that's positive, I would say, in regard to this is that there's a lot of ways of being in the world, and these personality traits are emblematic of different ways of being in the world. Creativity is a high return, high risk game. You can be very successful creatively, hyper successful, but the probability of failure is extremely high. Most people aren't entrepreneurial. 1 person in 50 wants to start their own business. And you hear everyone's creative. It's like, that is not true. We did research, creative achievement questionnaire, assessed long-term lifetime creativity across 13 different dimensions, 8 levels of creativity in each dimension. Literary. You've written an article for your local newspaper, right? That'd be like level 1. 0 would be, I have no talent or training in this area. 1 would be, I've written an article that was published in a local newspaper or online. Level 8 would be, I have multiple international bestsellers, aggregated across 13 domains. 70% of people score 0, right? The next most common score is 1, right? It's Pareto distribution. Almost everyone stacks up at 0. There's a number of outliers way out at the tail who have scores of 100, right? 30 bestsellers, multiple patents. Maybe they're composers. Maybe they're architects, right? Creativity is very rare, but so that's an expression of openness, intelligence. If you're hyper creative, you're hyper successful, but mostly you'll fail. So what's the point? There's lots of different ways of being in the world. There's 5 different niches that are associated with the traits. Each of those niches allows people to play a game that they could be successful at. A well-structured society produces a diverse range of games so that every person and every temperament in principle has a role to play. It's harder with the people who are low in conscientiousness, low in agreeableness, and high in neuroticism, right? Okay, let's close with the dark tetrad. When psychologists put together the list of adjectives from which they derived the statistical models, they noticed that if they put in evaluative terms like good or evil or good and bad, cruel or kind, that you got 2 dimensions, good and bad. And they knew there were more differentiated approaches to personality than good and bad, so they took out all the evaluative words. Then they got the 5-dimensional structure that we described that broke down into the 10 aspects. Unfortunately, they lost some real information by getting rid of the evaluative adjectives, and they've snuck back into the literature. That attenuated the relationship between personality and psychopathology, because personality traits aren't a great predictor of mental disorder. They're not too bad, but they're not great, partly because we got rid of the evaluative terms. Investigators into the dark tetrad of traits have re-investigated the evaluative terms. Dark tetrad types we talked a little bit about. This is the dark end of the personality spectrum. They're narcissistic. Personality-wise, that makes them extroverted and disagreeable. They're narcissistic. They want unearned social status. They're Machiavellian. That means they use their words to manipulate others, right? They're psychopathic. That means they're predatory. What's yours is mine, and parasitical. If I can get you to work for me, I will. Pimps are parasites, right? Criminals are parasites. Criminal pimps are parasitic predators. Psychopathic. A psychopathic person has no concern for you. You're a field of opportunity. And if you're agreeable, you're amenable to their machinations. That was the dark triad. That was studied by students of Robert Hare, who was the first person who mapped psychopathy in prison populations. Further investigation showed that if you were predatory and you were narcissistic and you were Machiavellian, so lots of fun to be around, you're also sadistic. You took positive delight in the suffering of others. And the behavior of the dark tetrad types is increasingly well understood. 3% of the population, almost all the online anonymous trolls who are poisoning the public discourse are dark tetrad types. right? They're a minority of the population, but now and then they get the upper hand. They get the upper hand after ideological revolutions, for example. And when that happens, there's blood in the streets, because the evolutionary niche for a dark tetrad manipulator is free sexual access with no responsibility. And the more chaos you can produce, the more likely that outcome. There's a strange pattern of male sexuality that's not much discussed. Most human sexuality is private. Rape during wartime is very common. In fact, it's common enough so you can track its consequences in human genealogy across the evolutionary line. When all hell breaks loose, the short-term maters rise to the top, right? And so they're motivated to spread chaos, because under normal circumstances, they're not very attractive to discerning women. So what they want is as much bloody mayhem and chaos as can possibly be managed, because that's their opportunity. And that's actually what seems to be something approximating a stable evolutionary niche. The stability of psychopathy is about 3%, 3 to 5. What seems to happen, if there's fewer than 3% psychopaths, everybody forgets that they exist, and they sort of go to sleep. And so then a psychopath can arise and no one notices, and they can be quite successful. But if they get above 5%, everybody thinks, uh-oh, there's a lot of psychopaths around here, and they wake up and take whatever measures are necessary to stop it from happening, and that seems to keep them at about that level. And so, anyways, who are the psychopathic predators? Well, they're immature people who retain the aggression that was part of their temperament when they were young. That's the easiest explanation, right? And why are they callous? Well, the typical 2-year-old really doesn't have much appreciation for anyone else. There's the basics of the beginning of empathy, but an unsocialized person is basically out for themselves. And some unsocialized people are also aggressive, and those are the ones that, if they're not socialized, well, they turn into the dark tetrad types that destabilize themselves and everyone else. So another thing that is worth being alert to on the personality side, if you're wise, is that people like that exist. And so keep your eyes open. All right, that's probably good enough. Where did we wander? Well, we talked about shamanistic and religious approaches to personality.